Everyday life issues broken down to help you build your own opinions on the issues that matter most. Coming to you from Austin, Texas, this is The Deciding Factor with your host, Alton Hill and John Herzog.
Hey guys, I'm John.
And I'm Alton.
And we are The Deciding Factor. Today's show, we've of course got a guest with us. We are going to cover things that you should do if you're ever investigated by an officer in any form or format, because there's some surprising things we should all be aware of. So our guest today is Brian Leslie. He is actually a former police officer himself for Canada. He was a police chief as well. He served there for 14 years. But now what he actually does for the last 6 years, he's actually run his own company doing forensic investigation and coercive interrogation and interview techniques. He has been not sponsored, but featured on several local media sites, news stations. One of the biggest one was ABC News, but he has also been in the paper. So he's actually appeared in New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today. So he is out there, and he has actually done over 2,000 interviews and investigations combined. And I tell you what, his knowledge and experience is very vast. He's been in very many big cases. He also is cleared to prosecute, or not prosecute, but be a part of the investigation for the U.S. military court, as well as federal and state law, local ordinances. His actual company is Criminal Case Consulting, Inc. So ladies and gentlemen, without further delay, Brian Leslie, how are you doing?
Good, how are you? I'm just going to correct a little bit. I'm not an investigator, I'm a forensic expert. So I testify in court. I do examinations of interrogations and interviews that occur through law enforcement. I look at them. I'm brought on by usually attorneys, the military, federal, state, public defender's offices, private attorneys. I'm brought on a lot of the time, primarily on high-profile cases, a lot of them, mostly homicide, sex offense cases, and major felony type cases. Wow. That's what I majorly do. So that's what I look at.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, I was looking at your resume and I was just like, man, there's no way I'm going to get all of this in a good intro for you, because there's just so much. I mean, you have been doing more than the average individual could absolutely do. I mean, you live at your office, don't you?
Yeah, I pretty much work 7 days if I'm not on the road testifying. I usually handle every state. I'm involved in, with COVID, it's been a little bit less testifying and more doing a lot of reports. Usually the process takes, I'm retained. They send me what I need to look at as far as the interrogation goes. I look at that, and then I do a full forensic report, which can range anywhere from 30 to 140 pages.
Wow.
Wow.
With that, it's a work product for a lot of the attorneys. I then am usually brought in by the time it goes to court. Sometimes the report does its job, and I'm not required to testify, but a lot of times I do testify. So I'm on the road quite a bit doing that as well.
Now, you also have several books that are out, and you have articles that you've written like crazy. Tell us more about these books that people can read.
Well, I have 3 books out. Actually, the books are basically on a methodology I created when I was actually policing, and it's called Reaction Analysis Profiling. And what I did back then is, as I was in my police career, one of the things, because I was more of an analyst, I became more of an analyst as a police officer and an investigator, because that type of training it put me in the area where I started looking at more detail and how things were conducted, how investigations were conducted. And not only that, but I really had concerns about being able to vet witnesses better. So I created a methodology where it was basically body language, where I began to create what's known as a baseline patterning with witnesses. So I developed a body language technique, which actually, and as I was chief, I tested it with polygraph, and it actually worked better. And one of the things that I was able to do was look at the eyes, the head tilt, and the and the mouth movement. And I used to create baseline, because what a lot of people don't realize is body language. A lot of people say, well, if you look up to the left, it means this. It looks up to the right, it means that. No, it doesn't. It's DNA based. So it's exactly like DNA. It's unique to the individual. So you have to create the baseline. You have to create a specific baseline. And that's the best way. If you read the book, it goes through interviews and what to do. But what usually you do is you look at 5 questions. You know they're going to tell the truth. You look at 5 questions that are subjective. And usually it's when I say subjective, they're going to tell partial truths, but they're not going to tell the whole truth. And then 3 questions that are a lie. And then you make the notes of the head tilt, the eyes and the mouth. And then you'll find that if you actually do this now in the interview, in the final interview, you'll be able to determine the deception in those areas. And so I used it in a lot of my interviews with witnesses, not suspects, but witnesses more than anything else, because I always believed that if a witness was giving me some sort of a story, just because of their look, because of the credibility that they appeared to have, was not necessarily the credibility they actually had. And that's one of the reasons why I always, as an analyst, I would look at saying, okay, I'm going to now, and it's called an inductive method of investigation, which means that you accept all information in an investigation, you vet the information, you vet the credibility of the information, and then corroborate it with other, if it's tainted, you corroborate it with other information or other direct evidence, which is individuals or physical evidence that would prove it. And then you draw what's known as inferences, and based on patterning those inferences, you draw a reasonable conclusion. And that's the way an investigation should be done. But unfortunately, with law enforcement, most of the time it's done deductive, which means you go in, you accept only the information that follows your narrative and that you're looking for to build a case, and you disallow exculpatory evidence, which is evidence for the defense. And therefore, you go into it tainted to begin with, and then you can't figure out why a suspect that you had targeted is denying having anything to do with the crime, because the fact is that they may not have had anything. So you'll always hear these terms. I just need to know the truth. You're not telling me the truth. The truth isn't the truth necessarily. It's your truth. It's what you think the truth is. And because you did a sloppy investigation, they're telling you the truth. You just don't know that.
Wow. So I guess to add to your intro as well, you are a keynote speaker. And then on top of that, you do train law enforcement officers to do things properly?
No, I do. I train a lot of attorneys.
Okay, that's what it is.
In what to look for. Law enforcement hasn't been so acceptant of that type of training. You have to understand police culture generally. They believe they know what they're doing a lot of the time. Now, there's a lot that would love to have the training. Sometimes it's just more difficult to get to those training people. And I would definitely, if anybody reached out to me, I would definitely provide that training to law enforcement. Because one of the things I really want to see is I want to see some changes in the way law enforcement do things when it comes to interviews and interrogations. And they're simple things, because they don't screw them up. But what happens is in suppression hearings, what happens is the simplest things suppress a confession that could have been avoided in the beginning. And these are things that I look at. And when I see what has been suppressed and how easy it would have been not to go in and do that, it just makes me want to go out and say, look, you guys need to do this or this or this. You know, it's too easy to do the way you're doing. But when you get to this point, just don't get overly zealous with it. Just do this.
So before we get going with the rest of the show, to all of our listeners, I want to make it very clear. I don't know what direction this conversation is going to go, but first and foremost, I am a big supporter of all policemen. I get that there's some issues going on out there. It might be extirpated, but right now, you know, I've got to say, it's one of those things. I really love the work that our men and women are doing in law enforcement. So please do not misinterpret any questions we ask or any things we might say to be harmful towards them. And to that, Alton, I pass on my witness.
Well, no, I was just thinking, Brian, that you're really digging into this, and I appreciate what you said, John. I think most people want justice, right? And there may be some muddy waters in here on how we get to that point. But Brian, could you tell us a little bit about why you kind of have this purpose and why you're motivated to do these things? Was there one point in your police career where you saw a case and you're like, oh man, we need to do this differently? Or kind of what fuels you to keep pushing in this direction?
Well, as I told you about my methodology, I tell you, there was one case that actually did push me in that direction. And it was a situation, it was a sexual assault allegation made against somebody. And that individual, she came in and she gave a 50-page statement, 100%. It was right on the money. There was no ambiguity whatsoever about the statement. I had already started at that point testing my methodology a little bit. And I looked and I listened and I said, look, you know what? I need you to come back in about 2 weeks and I want to take another statement from you, figuring that, okay, usually if you take a second statement, there'll be some changes in the statement. No, it was 100% right on the money. And so I went in and I said, okay, look, and I don't know why, but it was my methodology was showing that there was some deception there. And before, of course, the individual that was made this allegation was accused, I really had no choice but at that particular time but to lay the charges. Because everything was above board, everything was right on the money, and there was nothing that would direct me in. But I said to her, I said, look, I need you to go and take a polygraph. Would you mind doing that? And you don't I was chief of police at the time, so I could get away with polygraphing a witness. And I thought, okay, I'm going to see what happens here. And so she said, oh, yeah, absolutely, no problem. And most of the time that would say to you, you know what? She's more than willing to do it. She's got to be telling the truth. But I said, okay, I want to see what you do. So I sent her to the polygraph unit, and I said, and then they called me back and they said, no, Chief, she's totally telling the truth about everything. I said, okay, great. I said, what was the results of the polygraph? Well, polygraph was down, but we interviewed her for 4 hours. I said, no, I need to know. I need to know.
You passed the polygraph, but it was down.
I need from my own person, because there's a guy, and he was a fairly high profile individual. So this charge would have destroyed him and his family and everything else. And she then went about 3-4 days later again. And at that particular time, the polygraph unit came back and said, Chief, she lied about everything. And I said, so what was the result of the polygraph? She passed the polygraph. We told her she failed. And she came clean on everything. In fact,
my mind just blew up.
The fact is she was a sociopath, so she could easily pass a polygraph. But the fact was, the whole incident occurred. She was having an affair. She was caught by her husband. Her husband had told her, look, it's either one of two things. You're either having an affair or you were raped. So you make the choice. So to save her marriage, she made the allegation, and she in turn was charged herself, and she ended up getting prison time. But the fact of the matter is, had I not gone that route, this guy would have been sentenced and easily convicted.
Wow.
Okay, wait a second here. We got the chief of police accepting. Witness comes in, right, and says, I have charges against.
I have an allegation.
Perpetrator person over here. Yeah, this happened. I want you to know because he's bad.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, cool. You take the statement and sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I'm hearing what you're saying. So you accept the statement, but in your gut and based on the processes that you're architecting, right? You're like, I'm not feeling it. And so much so you're like, I'm going to try again and kind of confirm this feeling. Sure. Or not. It happens again. And you're so sure. You're like, no, you got to go down to the polygraph. You're still so sure.
Yeah, I didn't say she's got to go. What I suggested to her is, would you be prepared to take a polygraph? And she said, absolutely.
Right. Absolutely. She goes, the machine's not running. And you're like, it's not enough. So I'm just sitting here wondering, with police culture, how is it that no one's like, Chief, Knock it off. Like, give the lady a break.
Yeah. And this was exactly the point. And in fact, I called the attorney and I went to the court and had the charges withdrawn immediately as soon as that she came clean. But one of the things was that I believe that if you're going to follow evidence, follow the correct evidence. And it was after that, because I was trained in analytical investigative methods. And that's one of the courses I took in my very early days of policing. And I always never really used it up until that point. I started using it and analyzing investigative methods more as I started going through. And I realized that some of the witnesses that perhaps I started going back and looking at witnesses that perhaps, how are they presenting themselves? And what happens with a lot of police officers is that visually, for example, if you go in front of you're talking to an individual, and this is just typical human being. It's nothing to do with police culture and nothing to do with that at all. But if somebody's, let's say a manager of a bank, and you're talking to them and they live in a neighborhood, a nice neighborhood, and they're telling you that their neighbor walked into the backyard and stole their lawnmower, and they saw them, you're going to believe it. Because he's dressed in a suit, he looks really good, he's credible, he's got he's a bank manager. Why would you disbelieve him? Mm-hmm. So the fact of the matter is, what I learned to do was ask other questions and go in empty-minded. In other words, without predisposition, and go in with the idea that follow the evidence. Let's ask the right questions. Mm-hmm. If they were the right person, then that's great. But you have to have some follow-up questions that you need to test the credibility of individuals. And as a result of that, that's why I developed a reaction analysis profiling. It allowed me to continue to, it's not I would disallow a witness, I would corroborate the witness. I want more corroboration. I want to see what this witness, what they're telling me, is it correct? And if it's not correct, maybe it's partially correct. Maybe they just don't understand. And it's like I was telling you off camera before, I wrote an article called The Dominant Witness Theory. Most police officers would not understand this because it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. But when you go into a multi-witness event, what's the first thing you should ask a police or ask a witness is, what did you see? That would be the standard question that anybody would ask, any law enforcement would ask. That's not the question you should ask. The question you should be asking is, who did you speak to before I arrived? Because the dominant witness, and I've proven this over and over and over, and I'll tell you a story behind that. The dominant witness will integrate their narrative and potentially demean the individuals that they were all having a conversation at the time. Now, I'll tell you a bit of a story here, and the way I actually dealt with the dominant witness. I did lectures on about 30 different times where I brought in people, about 30 people, just random, thinking that they were going to be talking about something else than what I was actually talking about. And it was more of a research project for me over a period of 2 years. I did this. And I wanted to prove my point on the dominant witness. And I used the dominant witness myself when I was actually policing myself. And it was effective, and I'll tell you how that was effective. But what I did with these interviews was I would bring people in the room, and what I would do is I put up on the overhead 3 mugshots of 3 different people that looked very like they had been doing something. In other words, they were very suspicious looking. And they were actual real mugshots. And so what I would do is they would walk into the room. I wouldn't go in there for 20 minutes or so. I just let them, they don't know why those are up there. They don't know what I'm going to be talking about. They have no idea. And they would go in there and I'd come in and I'd turn off the overhead right away. And I would appeal to their egos. And what I would say to them is, look, how many of you guys are good at recall? Well, everybody's got an ego. They want to be they want to be that guy that's good at recall. So everybody puts their hand up. Yeah, I'm great. I'm amazing. I said, I bet you nobody saw the tattoo on the lower side of the neck of suspect number 2, the hexagon shape. And I'd say, oh, I got to take a call just a second. I'd leave and I'd listen to them. And they're arguing about who saw it and exactly where it was. and what it was. When I come back, at least 11 people out of the 30 put their hands up and say they saw it. And so I leave it. I then go and talk about something else. And I say, you know what? You guys are amazing. You guys are just incredible. I can't believe that you guys actually saw the hexagon, and I input the data into them. And so I'd say, and then I'd start saying, but I bet you nobody saw the 2 dots that are on the top of the tattoo. I bet you nobody's that good in this room. Oh, I just got to leave for a second. I'll be right back. You guys take a look, think about it, and then I'm going to come back. And I listen to them talk, and they're talking, and the dominant witnesses or the dominant people in the room are integrating that narrative and what they saw, and then others are following them. And when I come back, not only 11, but you've got now 18 of them now have seen it.
What?
And at least 10 out of those 18 have actually seen the dots. I talk for about another half hour. I don't talk about anything else. And then I say, okay, guys, I'm going to put up the three mugshots again. And I put up the mugshots, and there's no tattoo on any of them. They accuse me of literally trying to manipulate and that there was in fact a tattoo on there. And that in fact, I'm just cheating them.
So did you kick them all out right away? Did
No,
you say
it proved my point.
Right.
Less than an hour and a half, not only did they see a tattoo that doesn't exist, but they could describe it to you in detail. Now, you put that in a witness, and you put that on when you would go to a multi-witness event, and you say, look, it was a big event. Let's say there was a shootout, there was whatever, and let's say there was a car, it was blue. Well, the dominant witness may say, no, it was black. So what I used to do is I used to take the witnesses aside, and I'd say, look, I know you told me it was blue, but I bet you're smarter than that. I bet you knew something that you didn't tell anybody, and you were just embarrassed because you were afraid to tell me, right? And they'd say, well, kind of. Well, what is it you were afraid to tell me? And they would say, well, I thought it was blue, but I must be wrong. No, you're not wrong. You're not right necessarily, but it gives me some choices, and I'm not targeting a blue car. Huh. That's the dominant witness theory.
So then let me kind of, based on that and your story with the polygraph, I'm hearing that there's actually a lot of effort and like technical specialties required to really get good, solid evidence. And how hard is that to get in the current police culture, in your opinion? I mean,
first of all, you have to be open, number one. And when I took my original analytical investigative methods course in my early years of policing, one of the things that they taught, I never really understood it when they were teaching it, but I started using it, and then I understood it as I got a little older in policing. But you've got to go in totally with a blank mind. Mm-hmm. Look at only evidence. Don't get emotionally involved with the outcome. It's like a domestic, okay? If you have a predisposition when you go into a domestic that you don't like, let's say a man beating a woman, and let's say you really have a hate on for that. Maybe you've got some history in your own family, whatever.
Yeah.
You're going to be tainted walking in there in the first place. Mm-hmm. The question is, can you do an investigation that is clear, precise, and that you, even if the guy's angry when you walk in there, he may be angry for something else. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are you going to target him, or are you going to do a proper investigation where you're vetting the witness using an inductive method, where you're actually testing the credibility of both sides, not just one, but both sides. And then at the end, you draw inferences whether or not this is a real case, whether there's manipulation going on, and who has to gain from this. And if you can actually remove yourself from the narrative, you can actually get the true and follow the evidence. You're going to get a true result.
You know, some of the things that you've mentioned all have been kind of like word manipulation on kind of your part, or maybe investigator's part. You know, I was in the police academy way back in the day, and that was one of the things they really taught us was, you know, when you're investigating or you're trying to find out what's going on at an accident, is you've got to ask good questions, but on top of that, sometimes it includes manipulation of your wording to get the truth at times. I'll give you one really good example is when you go to a drunk driver, right? You got to prove that they're drunk. You've got some tests you can do, but one of those things that can exempt them is if they're diabetic. Right. So one of the questions they always said, go up to them and ask them, what type of diabetes do you have? Do you have A or B? And half the time they'll say, oh, I have B. And then right then and there, you don't have diabetes. Right. It's type 1 or type 2, not A or B. And I have used that myself in an accident that I walked up on where a guy was just flat out drunk. And he said he was type A as well, or type B.
Yeah. and it's, a lot of it comes from, when I look at, for example, I'll give you another example of a case. And this is a case where there was a child that had been at somebody's residence. They were babysitting the child. It was a husband-wife babysitting, and they would babysit this child. This child had an underlying condition that they didn't disclose to the family, and they'd known each other for a while, so they were babysitting this kid every so often. The child starts vomiting, about 2 years old, starts vomiting, and the father happened to be by himself at the time, so he picks it up and he runs to the sink, and he lets the child vomit in the sink. And then, so anyway, the child ends up with a serious condition, ended up having to call an ambulance, and of course now there's an investigation. Police call him in, and they want to help as much as they can. They want to be part of this investigation. So it's not like they would call a lawyer and say, well, should we go in? We have nothing to hide. I mean, we're just trying to give you what occurred. Mm-hmm. So this starts off as an interview, but as it turns out, there's certain questions being asked. So when you picked the child up and you ran to the sink, would you have shaken the baby maybe a couple of times, 3 times, 4 times? Well, I guess. Why wouldn't I? Well, okay. So then the conversation goes on a little further later on. Well, it was no more than 7 times or 10 times, right? You shook the baby. They're setting the narrative up for the shaken baby syndrome. And the fact is that was a child abuse case. And that's how he ended up getting charged. But at the end of the day, it was all found in his favor.
Wow.
But the fact that he didn't see it coming because of the narrative. It's another thing like going into cases where, I've done other cases where involving weaponry. And the guy starts talking about a gun. He took the rifle range or to the gun range. And so the interviewer starts saying, so you brought the weapon to the gun range. Then he starts utilizing the word weapon. Now it's a weapon that has a different dramatic context effect as to what the narrative was. It's not the same thing. So now you've got this guy who doesn't have any idea that they're creating a narrative of a weapon. It's more dramatic for a jury. It's not just a gun, it's a weapon. So there's a use of it at that point.
Wow.
So it's things like that. And it's creating those type of narratives or going in and talking to witnesses. And when a witness is having issues with, let's say, for instance, identification of a suspect, helping that witness out with that identification. Well, do you think he had long hair down to his shoulders? Well, maybe not down to his shoulders, but pretty close to his shoulders, right? Because you already know what you're looking for. And this, sometimes officers don't understand that they're trying to help, and maybe legitimately they're trying to help. But this is integrating a narrative that maybe this didn't happen. So now you don't know what the difference of the truth is versus what they actually saw. And a year later in court, it's very fuzzy. It's faded. They don't know why any longer. They know that they had actually not thought that at the time. And a good example of that is I had a case where it was a drug case, and the individual was an owner of a nice house. He was he owned a pretty well-off home, and he had 3 guys living there. They were 2 of them were drug dealers and one other guy that lived there. And they did a raid of the house. Well, eventually they did a raid of the house, and they had the attorney I was working with. This guy had They wanted, for the possession purposes, they wanted to identify him as a resident of that house. But of course, he had his own condo, and he only lived there with his girlfriend when they partied, and they were doing drugs. There was no doubt about that. But the issue really became that when I looked at the witness statement of the owner of the house, one of the things that struck me is that he seemed to be sure that this guy was a resident of the house. He was an off-site landlord, so he had a nice house. He rented 3 of the rooms to 3 guys that were partiers, young guys. Mm-hmm. And so when they were going to do cross-examination, I said to them, I said, look, ask him if he's ever had contact with the local police there, and of any nature, the owner of the house. He was a decent guy. He wrote a statement. He was now a witness, but he's going to testify that, in fact, this individual was a resident of the house. And so the question really was, did you ever have any dealings with the such and such police department? And he said, no, but did you ever go down there for any reason? Yeah, actually, I remember I went down, just before they raided my house about 3 months prior to that. And I said, ask him what was the reason for it. He didn't know the reason. He said, I remember going down there. I was meeting an officer, and I was supposed to just wait. I waited for like half an hour, and that's what he remembers. And then it all of a sudden starts sparking his memory. And he says, I said, well, and then the attorney goes, well, what was the point of going down there? He says, I really wasn't sure, but he says, they took me down a corridor. And then he started remembering. This was about a year earlier. Like, this is about a year. So he's at trial now. So this is about a year earlier. Mm-hmm. And he says, they showed me inside of a room, an interview room, and that's where I saw him. And they told me that guy lives at your house. That's how they embedded that information in his mind. He had no idea how he knew this. That's why he kept saying, I don't know how I know this. I just know he lives there. But once you walked him down that road, it all came out. He started recollecting. It was called reconstructive memory. And he actually started looking and remembering and recalling the facts.
Huh. So the guy that was on trial, that they were trying to convict, was not actually living in the house. I guess
No, he wasn't living there, but this landlord, because he was there for a week at a time with his girlfriend, they'd party.
Right.
But he wasn't him doing the drug dealing. It was the next door neighbor, one of the other guys in one of the rooms where they found most of the drugs, but they tried to tie it to him and wanted him in for the purposes of possession, wanted him in the room, and said he was a resident of that house. So, he had a knowledge, control, consent. And so as a result of that kind of threw that right out. The fact is, this guy hadn't known this except for that one incident where he was
in the police station.
And it wasn't until you walked him down that road and that aisle when he started remembering. And it's called reconstructed memory.
Wow. So would you consider the manipulation of wording by an officer to be just, right, needed? Like, how do you view that? Because I know some people would view the manipulation of your wording, especially like your example when you were chief of police to that girl where y'all had said that she passed the test but she didn't, or so it's like, how do you view that?
Well, I mean, you have to say, I'm going to say on every case that I look at, I'm going to say that for a lot of the times law enforcement is doing their best. Okay. And I always tell this to the courts. I always say, look, just because you have coercive questioning doesn't make it a situation where there's misconduct. It's nothing to do with that. And it's only in totality that you're looking at coerciveness. You can have a coercive question where you're minimizing it. That's not that's in part of the training, but that's not necessarily going to be coercive. But in totality, if you target a vulnerability, and that's one of the biggest things. A good example of that is what's known as a blackout confession. Okay, set up the sample as a blackout confession. You're in the interrogation room as an officer. the individual that you got in there is a well-known drug user. He's an alcoholic. He drinks a lot. He passes out a lot. Whatever. So you're building up the rapport in the beginning, and you're saying, look, as when I grew up, I was growing up, I used to drink a lot, and you're telling them stories that, or maybe make-believe stories, but you want to connect with them. So you're telling him stories that he can relate to, and you tell him about the parties you had. Maybe you were a nerd and you didn't have any parties, but you tell him anyway. And you're starting to say to him, look, did you ever have any parties like, oh yeah. And he starts connecting with you because he trusts you now. You start building, and sometimes it takes an hour and a half. And you go in there and you say, look, Frank, look, do you think maybe that this was committed? Well, you just don't remember because you blacked out? Well, no, I don't think so. And then eventually it's, well, maybe. And another hour later, it's, yeah, you know what? I think that's probably right, because you've minimized it to the point where he thinks, well, okay, it's an excuse for why I did it. Maybe I did do it. Maybe I just didn't know I did it. It's called a blackout confession.
Wow. So how often do you see people that, say I commit a crime, or I don't commit a crime, but I'm being accused.
Yeah, you did, John.
I did it. It was me. But how often do people say, get a verdict of guilty when they're not really guilty? How often does this happen?
Too often.
Really?
That's all I can say. Yeah, too often. And not because they believe that they've made a mistake. The fact of the matter is comes down to the deductive method again. You're not looking at the evidence properly. You're not willing to go out and look for real evidence. You're looking for what meets the narrative or what fits the charge that you laid. If you've got the ingredients of the charge, bang, 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 and that's what's making it fit, and everything's there. As a police officer, you may say, yeah, you know what? I got this one. This guy definitely did it, because you believed yourself based on the evidence that you looked at, not the evidence you didn't look at, or the evidence that you didn't want to see, because maybe somebody says, you know what? This witness down there says, no, he wasn't there. He was over there. Well, maybe you're not going to talk to this witness because now you spent all this time doing an investigation and he's going to throw a wrench into it. And so you've spent maybe 5 weeks doing an investigation, and maybe that one piece of evidence may be detrimental to question your credibility as an officer, and so your ego gets in the way.
Wow. So would you say they are deemed guilty while they're actually innocent? Do you think it's due to them, giving up and admitting guilt that's not really accurate? Or are they getting convicted by a jury even though there might not be the overwhelming evidence? Okay,
so let me kind of give you another example. And juries, keep in mind, well, who are juries? Juries are individuals that basically go in with the idea that they want to be helpful. They want to listen to the evidence. Truly, a lot of juries want to do that. But if you don't bring experts in to educate juries on what they're seeing in, for example, in a video, and I'll tell you another story. There's a case I did where I'm not going to say what state even, because one of the attorneys gave it to me, and he says, I want you to look at this. And I looked at it, and usually I spend maybe 7 to 8 hours on an interrogation video if it's 3-4 hours. And that's just to do the run through the initial, and then I get into the actual examination, and then I do a transcript, and then I look at every word that's being used and move back and forth. And this particular one, and I always look at time code burns, and time code burns are the numbers that are on the locked in video, where almost every police department in the United States has cameras with time code burns. Now, sometimes they choose to not turn them on. Other times they do. That's always an issue as well. Why didn't you turn it on when you had it? Why wouldn't you want to know what the time codes were? But in this particular case, he said, I'd just like you to look at this. And I got back to him within probably 3 hours. And I said, look, I've already spotted edits in the time code burns.
Oh, wow.
And I already spotted and I said, I'm going to look at this further. But by the time I finished, there was 47 edits in the seconds of the time code burns. And I always look for this. And what happens is, now this could be for any reason, but one of the issues is, why do you got 47 edits in a time code burn? And the issue is, and it was a capital case, so it was a very serious case. And so one of the things, the excuses were that, well, the camera is having some issues. Well, then I come back and I say, I looked at 3 witnesses that also were in that same room, and not a second missing that night. So there was literally 30 odd minutes of the time code burns missing, and very seamless.
Wow. What?
In audio, another issue, and I always tell attorneys to look at this. You've got mutes on certain word usage. And so you can, with software today, you can manipulate, and it's not every cop does this. It's not a situation where I find very, very seldomly do I see police officers using these types of techniques. It's very seldom. But the odd one, they make everybody look bad when they do stuff like this. And it really gives a bad name to sometimes when they are doing stuff like this, because it's not necessary. But I understand how they get there sometimes. They're in a position where they are dealing with the same stuff over and over again, and then they become a little more bold. It's part of the kind of the police culture in some cases. And more of the guys that are kind of experienced, they get a reputation of getting convictions. And then the ego starts to go there, and that's when these sorts of things, they cross lines, and they shouldn't be. And I can tell you honestly, generally speaking, most police officers, if I see any type of coercion in the interrogation room, it's not purposely done. It's done because they're overzealous, trying to get to where they need to go. And sometimes they just, with a little bit more training, they could actually avoid these mistakes that are so simple in a suppression hearing, that they put themselves in question, as far as their interrogations. And yet I've seen perfect ones. And I've said to this many times. I've said this even in court. I've said, I'm impressed with this interrogator. He's very, very good. And I've made a point of saying that, because I meant it. I didn't just say it, I meant it. But I didn't like certain questions that he asked, because that became coercive at times, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I don't look at, and just like I look at my cases that I get, I don't look at the individuals and I don't taint them with the same brush. There are certain ones that are bad. There's certain ones that are amazing, that are really good, that do the job that they're supposed to do, but just make a couple of errors. That's that's human.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that's why you have experts to go in and correct those errors if need be in the trial. That's why you have a system in place to protect an individual so he's not convicted properly.
But the timestamp that you referenced, I mean, did somebody get in trouble for that, or?
I pass on my information to the attorneys, and they do what they need to do with it. So I just move on to the next case. But it's one of these situations where you got to wonder, and I've seen other things. I mean, I've seen I could tell you stories, many, many stories, but because I'm brought on these types of cases all the time. So
yeah,
I see different, and believe it or not, I also see almost modus operandi for different states. In other words, that certain states have certain bad habits. And I see that pattern as well, because I do enough of them. I do probably 49 of the 50 states. So I actually see patterns of certain departments, certain states, certain counties, and you see the same thing. Not that they're bad, but they just have this similar, and it's training. It's nothing to do with manipulation, or they're trying to manipulate. And I honestly say, with the amount of, and I always make a point of saying this, because it's, the amount of actual misconduct is very minimal compared to what people probably think it is.
Of the police officers.
Sure.
Coercion is rampant in a lot of cases, because it's the training that they get. and sometimes they don't know how to utilize the training, and overzealousness in the interrogation room, bad investigations, like I've said to you before. One of the things is like an investigation is like baking a cake. If you don't bake the cake, don't put the icing on it. The icing is the interrogation. You have to have the presumption of guilt to go in the interrogation. So if you don't bake the cake, if you haven't baked the cake, don't put the icing on it. It's going to fall through.
So you've opened up a whirlwind of questions now. So, you have the right to trial by jury, or you can have a judge be your sentencer and everything, right?
Sure.
In your opinion, what do you think is better, to have a judge or a jury?
That's subjective. Depends on the case, depends on the charge, depends on a lot of things.
But we should think about having a judge as our person, right?
Well,
depending on what your attorney says, obviously, but
yeah, ultimately what you need to have is you need to have more awareness of what to look for, and training is everything. If people and were willing, and I'm going to use that word, willing, to learn. Some are so set in their ways they're not going to, and this is DAs and there's a lot of politics involved sometimes in these cases too. Mm-hmm. But if you're prepared to look at fact, to know how to look for fact, and to vet fact and the source the fact came from, you'll be a much better investigator, number one. You'll have very few times when you're going to have flaws. You may not get the same conviction rate, but you shouldn't be getting that conviction rate if it's not correct anyway.
So yeah, that's the wrong question. So
and let me just end that by saying there's a lot of pressure put on officers too, that you need to get this, you need to, you got to go and get a charge on this, and
why is that?
Yeah, it's just they justify their existence. I don't know. You get as a police officer, and I went through the ranks myself, and as a police officer, you're getting constantly you're dealing with so many, if you're a radio car, you're dealing with so many calls that you really have trouble to follow up each one thoroughly. And that'd be a big criticism. People would say to me, well, how do you expect us to do that when we get so many calls and you're overburdened with the amount of investigations? That's true. Manpower is a big deal. You have 20 investigations that maybe you're doing at the same time. And yes, you're going to make mistakes. There's no doubt about it. But if you can go into these things and say, look, here's what the evidence is. Here's what I'm looking at. Follow the evidence. First of all, don't follow your gut. Follow the evidence. Your gut is good, but your gut will take you in a direction that you may not want to go, because your predisposition may be brought out in that gut.
For sure.
You may have a dislike towards certain individuals or certain types of individuals that you don't even know you have those distastes.
So, but you basically said that, they have these quotas in a sense. It's like they're a salesperson.
I'm not going to say a quota. No, I don't want to use the word quota. It's not a good, okay, here's how every department's differently, how they judge that. But let's say, for instance, I do nothing. I got nothing coming in. Or I write no tickets. I'm sitting around all day and I'm doing nothing. I'm going to be, in my assessments, I'm going to be said, well, why is everybody else active and you're the only one sitting around? That's going to be a problem. Mm-hmm. So now on the other side of it, you've got a reputation for getting down and dirty and getting a lot of convictions and getting a lot of charges. You get kind of put on a pedestal. So it becomes partially a bit of an ego, and it feeds the ego a little bit. But so as a result of it, you may do things that you may start cutting corners a little bit that maybe you shouldn't. And it all comes down to training.
But who's putting this pressure on it? Is it like the chief of police, or is it the city council? Like, who is?
It's usually from higher up. I mean, from whatever in the administration side, they want to see certain clearances. Let's say there's a gun problem in an area. Mm-hmm, yeah. They want those guns off the street.
Yes.
They've made that pretty clear. They want guns off the street. And you're now in that gang unit that's going to go out there. Well, what's the first thing you're going to try to do? You're going to try to get guns off the street. Mm-hmm. So what ends up happening is you may get a little bit more overzealous to that. And that's why you see these departures from proper conduct that we see in the media all the time. is that there's bad officers out there. I'm not going to say there isn't, because there is. Absolutely. They give good officers bad names. And one of the things about, like, even uniform officers, is one of the things they should be doing is knowing their neighborhoods, knowing their districts, knowing the people in them. Get out, walk around, talk to people. People will get to know you. They will trust you, and you'll never have these major issues of targeting individuals, because you'll know all the information.
Yeah.
When I used to go into districts and stuff, I used to take my time. If I was starting on the first day in a district, I would take the next year and walk around and get to know the people in the neighborhoods. Yeah. I'd create programs that I'd be involved in, that I'd involve them in. They'd know me by name. They trusted me. The trust was built in those neighborhoods and those districts. And that's a no-brainer. But and there's good officers that do that every day, but those guys never get in top of the media. These are not the people that get in the media.
Yeah.
Okay.
So based on what's going on in the world right now, I know obviously Canada's going to be a little different, but the U.S.
Well, I deal with the U.S. mostly. I don't deal with Canada.
Okay. So in dealing with what's going on in the U.S. here with the Black Lives Matter, the defund the police, would you say, based on the cases you've handled recently or in the last several years, do you really see a lot of blatant racism or favoritism, or what have you seen?
Well, I mean, I'm going to say that just in the amount of cases that I see, and if I was to do, I do a lot of cases in the U.S. I mean, 100% of my caseload is the U.S. I don't do anything else. I happen to be a police officer in Canada, but my whole business is in the U.S. It's not in Canada. But I'm going to say that if you were to look at the cases that I deal with and the people that are charged, wrongfully convicted, there's a pattern there.
What's that pattern?
There's a pattern, and it's a pattern of showing that type of thing. But it's not necessarily, you'd have to look at each individual situation. Did they actually go out and target that individual because they were of non-color or of color? That's you'd have to look at that. And yes, it exists, 100% exists. But how rampant it is, it's coming out now how rampant it is.
So you're saying it's not the initial part, but once they're in this process, then race actually plays a part at times.
Yeah, I would say that racism, to say that there's not racism of a large nature, it'd be ignorant to say that, because it's there. But to say that every officer participates in that, I'd say that's wrong. I'd say yes, some officers do, probably a lot of officers do. And it's not, what a lot of people think is that racism is, they target, what they do is it's fear. It walks on fear. They work in a neighborhood that they see this every day, and they build up a fear. And so they assume that if they stop somebody of color, that person's going to have a gun. Why would you assume that? Why would you assume that?
So what I'm hearing you say, Brian, is that when you're looking and analyzing these wrongfully convicted, or when the attorneys are bringing you in as an expert on these cases, this is part of the pattern that you see, that because there may have been a prejudice mindset, or, these preconceived notions, that played a role in
potentially.
Now here we are with a wrongful conviction, or just like misconstrued evidence, or what we've been talking
there's
about.
A high number. There's a large number. I deal with large numbers. I mean, there's a large number of non-white clients that I deal with every day. And the fact is that people would say, well, is racism a major problem? Absolutely, it is. Absolutely.
Wow.
Because what happens is, like I said, you have to go back to the base of how this takes place. And a lot of it is just officers that first of all, they should never have been hired in the first place. Yeah, there's a lot of great officers out there that actually know how to deal with their communities properly. They respect people for being people. And I was one of those officers. I would think there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them out there.
Sure.
But those are not the ones you see in the news. Those are
not the ones that you deal with, right? Because the cases don't come because they're avoided with the right techniques.
I'm sure if you were to ask any neighborhood to say, well, how do you get along with your police officers in the neighborhood? There's going to be hit and miss. They're going to say, yeah, there's some really good ones, but there's some terrible ones. Absolutely. And that comes down to training. It comes down to who you're hiring, the hiring process. It all comes down to that. But, from my point of view, looking at it as a police officer or as doing what I do as a forensic expert, I look at it saying, there's things that should have been done differently here. Did you target this individual based on evidence that was flawed? Did you do the proper investigation? Remove yourself from the equation and follow the evidence. Yeah. Don't follow your bias. And you need to lose the bias to follow the evidence. Because if you can do it, it's like going to the gym every day. You have to do it every day. You have to be able to say, look, I don't care about anything I believe personally. I'm going to go into this investigation. I'm going to look at what the evidence is, and I'm only going to target what the evidence takes me to. And if you can do that, you'll be a good cop.
You'll be a good human. Right? I mean, I know we're talking about this under the umbrella of policing.
And what has to happen is police officers are human and they do make mistakes, but you need to work on the idea of being part of your neighborhoods, part of your districts, part of the people you police. These are the people you're going to police. These are decent people. Sure, they may have some flaws, they may be criminals, but I always here's the way I looked at the criminal element in my districts. I used to love going around talking to them all the time. I called them my clients. They were regulars, but I could still, even if I'm arrested one the night before and I saw them on the street, we'd sit down and have a conversation. They're human. And we'd bond. We'd say, you know what? Yeah, I'll talk to you again tonight when I'm working. And
that's savage.
But it was great. They trusted me. I liked them. It was nothing personal. I did my job. I followed evidence. I was always a reasonable guy. And as part of that, I learned to basically accept people for who they were. And as a police officer, you're going to deal with all sorts of people. So can you accept them? Yes, sometimes they're bad, sometimes they're good, but you've got to accept them and learn to get into districts. And I understand some people work in some really bad areas and it taints them. And the whole point is maybe they shouldn't be in those areas.
Well, I know John went through the academy. When I was younger, I considered, a career as an officer. And I actually spent all in all about 24 hours riding around with one of the sheriff's deputies in my county. And my realization after that time was I could totally do the job. I'm a good guy. I love justice. I can handle these types of scenarios. And we saw all sorts, it seemed like, on my short time in there. I said, at the end of the day, I don't think I could go home and not look at everybody like you're a criminal, because all the people that we were around that entire time were criminals. Sure. It wasn't like we were going and checking on all the people doing the right thing. And I thought, oh man, I don't know if I can, separate that. And so I think it's a huge challenge as a police officer. And I think it's a big job to ask somebody to do. But if you're prepared to go in there, I think you need to go in and there's some really good officers out there. I know I've worked with, even in my early days with gang units and things like that. They know the gangs. They know some of the gang units even, but they're not popular amongst their own guys because they are more decent towards some of these people. And that's where the police culture gets in, is the good ones that do a lot of good in the communities are kind of ostracized a lot of the time by the other officers. And that's not fair either, because there's some good officers out there that do programs. You see them all the time. They run gyms for, inner city kids and things like this. That's amazing stuff. Yeah. That's stuff that it doesn't get in the news, but there's lots of good ones out there.
So
For sure.
I don't want to make this show all about racism, but I've got to dig in a little deeper here. So seeing that you've presented your view and opinion, how do we fix that racist issue?
I'll tell you exactly how you would fix it. And if I was chief in another department again, here's how I would do it.
Tasers?
One of the things, first of all, you got to start from ground zero.
Okay.
You got to start from ground zero, because what happens is the older ones are tainted. They're tainted. You're not going to change the newer version of them. If I was to do another department again, one of the things that I would make as a mandatory requirement when you come onto the department is your first year of probation, that you have to, first of all, create a program in an intercity area or some area where it's a vulnerable area, and that program has to be successful. Two things will be adapted from that. Number one, you will get to know your neighborhood. You'll get to know the area very well because of the program you're running. And not only that, but you'll also be sympathetic and understand the people that you're dealing with. And therefore, that will make you a better officer down the road, because you'll never lose that ability to do that. And in fact, it's quite enjoyable. I always enjoyed stuff like that. I always enjoyed working in my neighborhoods and really getting to know everybody. And it was just, to me, that was my job. So, and when I had to do, work in different units and things like that, I was known anyway. So, I mean, bigger cities have bigger problems, and you're always going to have, a lot of violence in certain areas, gang activity. But even that, you can work with the neighborhoods, because the neighborhoods they don't like the gang activity either most of the time.
Yeah.
So if you know your neighborhoods, then you can get information on these gangs very easily, because they don't want them there either.
For sure.
But you have to make the effort.
So you just spending more time on the streets, the problem with that is you got to have more money and more officers to make that happen, right?
You know what? Every officer that's out there has the ability, when they're not doing calls, to get to know their neighborhoods.
But
There's no excuse for that.
How often do they have downtime on average?
Well, it depends department. Every department's different. You got smaller departments that will have more downtime. You'll have bigger departments that are maxed out and they can't do it. But the fact is, they get to know pretty much I'll tell you right now, at most departments, you're going to find that the 911 callers are usually the same people over and over again. You get to know the 911 callers. You go to the same calls all the time. You go to the same domestic people all the time. You go to the same disputes all the time. You get to know these people and how you deal with them, they get to know you as well. So they're part of the package, why you became a cop in the first place.
Alton keeps getting called on for running around the neighborhood with his firearm on his shoulder.
So that kind of reminds me, when I was young, we had a DARE officer, and I was in a totally white town. This guy was black, and he was all in on the DARE. Well, later when I got older, I saw him and the guy smoking a cigarette, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this DARE officer that I loved is saying don't do drugs. Like, he's smoking every day. And then I was like, it was kind of shook, but I always knew him. I had a relationship with him. And when I saw him, it was like, oh, he's the DARE officer. I know him. It's not like, oh, there's a cop. And so there was a completely different relationship.
And what you're saying right now is a good example of, you remembered him.
That's right.
And what people don't realize is every officer on the street, when you're talking to young people particularly, everything that you say to them, they will either be reflecting down the road, whether you make a kid hate cops or you make them like cops. It's how you present yourself, and you should be that example.
Yeah. And then later I remembered, like, well, I know why he was in DARES, because he was smoking. He's like, man, I don't want these kids to be doing the same thing. But he was a great guy, and I certainly have fun.
And these are the guys that you'll never see in the media.
But
you'll never see them in the media.
But I still don't see that as the biggest or best solution to really just stop racism, because just going and having conversations with people in the neighborhood, I mean, you were just talking about how people are getting convicted, which means the investigator himself has got to be of a racist nature in order for
I
this to go down.
I wouldn't go so far as to say of a racist nature. I would go so far as to say maybe predisposition, looking at evidence that doesn't exist, not looking and doing a deductive method of investigation versus inductive.
Okay.
If you follow the evidence and you follow the evidence to the investigation and use an inductive method, that it shouldn't even, color is blind at that point.
Yeah, and I think too, John, it's like you can't just say, well, how do we stop shootings? There's not always an answer that just says, hey, this is it too. But I love the idea of, systemic change and an idea. And I've been thinking too that jujitsu. So I train a lot of jujitsu, and I see these videos about, of course, it's the ones that I see, not the ones that I don't see. But I see cops that are not trained in jujitsu, and I'm like, oh man, just a little bit of jujitsu could have made this, de-escalated this situation so quickly. And now after talking to you, I'm sitting here going, oh man, imagine how much drama can be avoided.
Sure.
Learning some of the techniques that we've talked about today. It's a great, huge tool set or skill set of wisdom that can avoid so many problems.
Yeah. And basically, when you go into situations, and one of the de-escalation, it's taught in police departments. I shouldn't say it's not taught. It's taught very much so. But how to de-escalate comes to also a mindset too. Mm-hmm. Do you walk into a situation that you're in charge and that they're not, and that you're going to push that hammer down? The fact is how you talk to people. It's like human beings generally. How you talk to people generally is going to get them to do what you want them to do by example, not by pushing it.
That's a great point, because I have he's actually a state trooper for Texas, so state police, and he recently retired. He's been doing jiu-jitsu, I don't know, on and off maybe 10 years. And I asked him, I'm like, okay, well, since you started jiu-jitsu, how well has it worked on the street? That's what I was talking about. Does jiu-jitsu work in the streets? And he goes, honestly, Alton, since I've learned jiu-jitsu, I've never had to use it. And I'm like, well, that's good. I'm thankful for that. And he goes, no, I don't think you heard me. He said, I haven't had to use it because I'm confident that if I needed to use it, it would be fine. And therefore, I'm never in a scenario where I have to, because I'm fine and I'm confident. And it never comes to that because I know jiu-jitsu. And I was like, so.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anyway.
And most of these issues, when it comes to, you see a lot of these situations where you have people put in chokeholds and things like that. Bottom line is with more officers there, nobody should be getting hurt. Nobody should be choked out. Right. When you have the more officers on a scene, most people look at that as, all these officers are beating this guy. No, actually it's opposite of that. The more officers there, the less chance that person is going to get hurt, and less chance an officer is going to get hurt. So when you have 3 or 4 officers standing around and one's doing all the rough work on the ground, that should be totally avoided. You shouldn't be standing there. You should be assisting, holding wrists so no one's throwing punches, and et cetera, et cetera. And once the person's usually calmed down, they may be on something. They may have some mental issues, and those things can be addressed at that point. But the fact of the matter is that sometimes what happens is escalation starts from the approach and how you approach a person. When you approach a person, if you say, hey, you, that's not like, hey, excuse me, can I talk to you just for a sec? Big difference.
It is, for sure.
And there's no need to go and say, hey, you, get over here. If they're starting to not do what you ask them to do, I always had 3 things that I used to do: ask, demand, and enforce.
So what about, would it be, so we did a podcast on racism in America. One of the ideas that I said was internal investigations needed to be done by a federal unit instead of a by-city basis. Then you could take away a lot of the people that are buddies and all that. So would you say that's a pretty good idea to help combat all this, as well as a lot of training is what it sounds like, that may be structured federally rather than
different training.
Right.
I think they attempt to do training that they feel is necessary, but I think they downplay some of the areas that it starts at the very base of ground zero. And so you have to say to yourself, okay, when I'm bringing an officer on a police department, he's all gun-ho, he's young, He wants to help the world, now he's going to get 5 years later, let's fast forward 5 years later, he's tainted. He's listened to other officers talk about how they hate certain people, how they dislike this and how they dislike that. They want to be part of the team. So now it's them and us and this mentality. That's a police culture. And what has to happen is that has to dissolve to a certain degree. And somehow in there, you have to start from ground zero and make it a team effort, but a team effort to assist the street, to make the street a better place for everyone, not just because most people think that, well, all these, like I said before, these gangs are a problem. Yes, they can be a problem, but if the people that are in these neighborhoods, they're living there because sometimes they can't live anywhere else, and they're stuck with these gangs too. They would want nothing more to have the gangs suppressed or gone than anybody else. But the issue is, an officer goes into these projects and looks at these people. They see gang, they see the person as a neighbor, and they see them as a gang. They see them as a gang, and everybody's a gang. It's not that way. And you have to distinguish and look at the people who they are. And if you knew your neighborhoods, and if you knew the people you're policing, you would already know the answer to that.
Yeah.
You would already know the answer to that.
So we've gone over a lot of different things in this conversation. What about any other justice issues that you see here in America, especially when it comes to wrongful accusals?
Well, I think, like I say, and when it comes down to the accusations, the problem we run into today is we have this idea now that if you challenge a victim, an alleged victim, if you challenge an alleged victim, that's wrong. You shouldn't be challenging any alleged victims. What you should be doing is listening to them, supporting them, which is true, but you also owe it to the individuals who are targeted as the accused, also because let's look at it this way. If you're successful in making an allegation, I'm talking about a major felony type allegation, that person may be facing 50 years, 30 years, 70 years, 80 years. That's a life sentence. That's the end of his life.
Yeah.
So where do we say, let's not do this? Let's not vet the victim. Because by not vetting the victim or the information the victim may be supplying and doing your job as an investigator, you're basically saying that we're okay with this.
Yeah. And
I'm not okay with this. And that's one of the things that I believe that, yes, if you have an allegation that something happened to you, you know what? I support you 100%. But also, because it's such a serious allegation and that you're pointing the fingers, I'm going to do my investigation as an officer, as what I'm required to do, and I shouldn't have political pressure to not go that direction.
Yeah.
How often would you say that people admit guilt themselves when they know they didn't do it, just to, I guess, avoid a bigger sentence or whatever the case may be?
What happens is there's a manipulation that goes on in many parts of this. And inside the interrogation room, for example, it's called minimization or maximization. And what happens is, it's when you minimize in the interrogation room, a person comes in, they know they didn't do anything, but they keep saying, I didn't do anything. I didn't do it. The interrogator is believing that he's got evidence, and he believes this evidence. He didn't do a good investigation, mind you, but he still believes that this guy's the target. He's going to use coercive methods, and not all of them, every question is coercive in nature. It's a totality of it. But he's going to set the stage for saying, and one of one of my ones I see a lot, I'll tell you a typical one in an interrogation room is, okay, what you did up here was, or what, there's murder up here and what you did is way down here. And maybe what they did up down here is really actually over here. Mm-hmm. And what I need you to do is, all she wants you to do is admit that you know, that you take responsibility for this. And she just wants you to acknowledge it and apologize. So this guy's thinking in his head, I didn't do anything, but I'll do this if that gets me out of here because I've been in here for 5 hours. Mm-hmm. So next thing you know, he's given a piece of paper. He's starting to write an apology letter that he doesn't want to say. And that's a confession.
Wow. So how often does not having money, you know, Corona's hit, everybody's lost all their savings. Mm-hmm. Some of us don't even have jobs. How often does not having money lead to you being convicted or not being able to fight it correctly?
Depends on, you know, like in any case, you're entitled to a public defender. But like anything else, there's good ones, bad ones, you know, in different, they deal with huge caseloads. So you keep that in mind. Yeah. And sometimes even the ones that pay for attorneys, I mean, pay a lot of money for attorneys and, you know, really, it doesn't make any difference. And so I would say that money isn't about so much as, to get a good attorney and it's not so much the attorney that you need. What you need is the team that goes into a trial. The attorney may be great at what he does, but you also need, let's say, a DNA expert. You need all the experts. Now, indigent people can also access, and I'm paid a lot of the time by the courts myself. So a lot of the time I get paid by the state, by, you know, the feds, you know, on the defense side. So
would you say one of the number one things would be to, next to your attorney is, of course, have somebody like you get hired to help save their
And there's lots of experts out there for different things. I mean, if it's a question of a ballistics situation, for example, involving a weapon, you should have a ballistics expert on your team. Teams are what really put together a good defense. It's not so much of the lawyering is amazing, some of them, but also they're the ones that are smart enough to get a good team together too.
Yeah.
They get a good investigator to do the investigation. They get good experts on, and they present a good case. And those are the cases that, you know, when they reach out, and like I say, there's some attorneys that will not reach out to experts. There's other attorneys that just always reach out to experts because they know that that's the main lifeline of their client.
Gotcha. Yeah, it sounds like that's the real question when you call an attorney is who's on your team.
And it's not about who's on your team. Who will you bring on to the team?
Yeah,
based on my case specifically.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I guess let's do this because I think we've covered a lot and we could probably go on forever if we really wanted to because you've got some crazy stories.
Yeah,
and I'm digging them all. But the question of the day is, what is the first thing you should do if the cops want to question you? So let's do that deciding factor.
Now it's time for our deciding factor.
All right. So based on, you know, the things you said today, Brian, some of the things that I've seen in the past from, you know, police academy or going to court myself, or even getting a handgun license, I'm going to steal their line. If a cop wants to question you, I mean, if it's a speeding ticket, guys, come on. I want to move on with my life. That's what I would do. Mm-hmm. However, anything that could be a Class A misdemeanor, Class B misdemeanor here in Texas, you know, shut up. Don't worry about the attorney. The first damn thing you should do, according to my opinion, would be just shut the heck up. You can get yourself in so much trouble just on one wording. Just like you said earlier, you said a weapon instead of a gun can make things sound so much more serious in the situation. So I don't need an attorney first. I need to shut up first. Otherwise, I can dig a hole before I even have an attorney. And I mean, you got to use your head. That's the problem. There's a lot of people that don't have common sense. And to me, it would be very
I'm
common
going to
sense.
disagree with the common sense thing, because what happens, and anybody that knows, and a lot of people probably that are going to listen to this have probably been there themselves. They come in to assist. The idea that you're assisting anything, the fact that you're going down, you may think you're going down there for a totally legitimate reason.
Right.
But until you realize that that's not the reason why you're going there, if you're told to go into an interview room, you know what, get on the phone, talk to an attorney, find out whether you should do that. And you know what, here's a good idea. Listen to your attorney. Don't come in thinking that and you know what, and I have attorneys tell me this all the time. Why would my client, after he called me, I said, I don't want you to talk to them. And yet he goes in and he gives them a full confession. Yeah. And I say, look, because the problem is he didn't do anything and he wants to help the police. He wants to clear his name. He himself personally realizes he didn't do anything. And this is where now the segue into becoming a witness to a person of interest, to now a suspect, to now an accused, all in 4 hours.
Yeah, I mean, it always goes back to the way you word things. It's just like I got in a confrontation with a guy in our neighborhood several years back. You know, he had threatened several people, and it was just, why are you here? You walked from Austin down to where we were at, which was a few cities south, and it's just like, you don't belong here. Well, the guy ended up, make a long story short, he swung at the guy, one of my neighbors, and hit him. I mean, almost knocked him out. But he didn't say that he was hurt during that incident. So the cop couldn't arrest him or do anything for it. It's because of his wording. He hits you. Whether you want to take your ego into account or not, he hurt you, period. That's how he goes to jail. Otherwise, he's free and he goes about his day. Same thing. You know, if you shoot somebody, the way you word it can determine you're guilty or not, even if you're innocent. And
well, it
that's
can make you a crime suspect.
Or that too. Yeah. So, okay. So I went with shut up. You're going to say attorney. Is that right, Brian?
Yeah.
All right, Alton. Finish this up.
Well, look, if this podcast today has done nothing, it's
stop listening, right?
Made me think how uneducated I am in this area. And in all honesty, I'm all about like freedom, and I served as a juror on one case. It was a rape case, so it was a very serious case. Sure. And one of the things that I really learned that I love about the United States of America is that you were innocent until proven guilty. And I had always known that as an American. Oh, yeah, you know, we're Americans. Go America. And then I don't remember if it was the lawyer or, you know, one of the people in court said, like, that's not true everywhere. And I was like, wow, that's a whole different scenario, that I'm guilty because someone said so and I have to prove my innocence. And so, having said all that, I'm not an expert, and understanding that there are some what I'm going to call shady tactics that can be used to deceive me. You know, I can be lied to, I can be coerced, I can be just really manipulated. I'm going to be super, super careful and probably keep my mouth shut and call the attorney, as well as try to continue to educate myself on these things so that I can make the best decision. Because like there's this saying, ignorance doesn't count, right? Like if you're ignorant of the law, it doesn't matter. So having an awareness and making this a priority to understand a little bit more, I think will serve every human well, so that you don't make a mistake out of ignorance. Because it's not gonna be a good excuse. So that's my thoughts on it. But Brian, thank you so much. This has been so enlightening, and I love some of those stories that you shared that can really help us understand the current climate and your take on some of the racism that's happening today.
Yeah, Brian, it has been a pleasure to listen to your stories, your wisdom and knowledge. I mean, this conversation was just fantastic from my point of view, at least. So,
yeah, certainly.
That was great. I mean, the fact of the matter is everybody, if you can learn a little bit at a time, I'm in an area where very few people know what goes on in these situations. And it's kind of more of the peek behind the scenes a little bit. And some of this stuff is very, elementary that can be corrected very easily. But it has to be people that want to correct. And,
right.
As I always say, good people will change things.
Wow. Well, let's leave it with this. You've got your own company. You've got Twitter, it looks like. How can people get in touch with you, and how would you advise them to do so?
Well, I mean, if you need to get a hold of me, go to my website, coerciveinterrogationexpert.com. That's my website. The issue is also, you can also go to, I have another website for post-conviction where I actually have a 23-page free download that you can do about interrogations and everything you need to look at if you're looking at it, your own paperwork, and you're curious whether you need an expert or not. It's called convictedhub.com, and it's a free download down there. You can also download one of my books for free, which is Deception of a Witness. So you can go there and do that. And all my numbers are on there if you need to get a hold of me.
Nice. And then you're on Twitter as Crime Case Consult, right?
Criminal Case Consult.
Case Consult. Okay.
Quite honestly, I don't have a lot of time for Twitter, so if you tweeted me, you'd probably be a week and a half before you ever get it back.
See, I'm more of a Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It's just
I'm so busy. I get most of my stuff in email, so and you can always go and fill out a form on one of my websites, and I'll get back to you fairly quickly.
All right.
Well, thanks so much for giving us some of your time. We certainly
absolutely.
Appreciate you.
I'm glad people get to see a little bit more and get educated a little bit, because a lot of these things need a change, but change can only be done one brick at a time. So there's a lot of things that people don't realize, and conclusions are jumped to regularly, and people need to start looking at and analyze.
So random question: if the president, whoever it may be this year, next year, comes to you and says, "Come be a part of my team and rebuild all of this mess," would you do it?
Oh, absolutely. I'm all for getting things back on track the way they should be. I mean, people are human. They're going to make mistakes. People are going to have bias. You're not going to change people. But what you can do is through example, change things. And I think people need to pay it forward more than they do. I think if one person influences somebody else to do something good, that takes off on a large scale.
Yeah.
Man, thanks again, Brian. I can't tell you how much fun this was.
No, it's great. I enjoyed it.
And hopefully maybe we'll see you again in the future and be able to hear more stories and pick your brain more.
I'm here all the time. I can talk for hours.
All right, guys. Y'all say bye.
All right.
Bye.
Talk to you guys.
This has been another episode of The Deciding Factor, giving you food for thought on real-life issues. Be sure to click, like, and subscribe to this podcast, as well as all your big social media outlets, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Don't forget to check out our website at thedecidingfactorpodcast.com and give us comments and feedback. Until next time, stay safe and remember to keep an open mind.